Good afternoon. This is Wiebe Nauta with the second lecture in 2020 on colonialism and politics in Africa. Wishing you welcome, and sadly we have to meet like this again, but hopefully it is interesting enough. Today we'll speak about external interference and cruelty in the Congo. And for me, that symbolizes and explains quite a few mechanisms involved in colonialism. But before going to the Congo, it's important to also look at some of the issues we're facing in the Netherlands. This is the so-called traditional arrival of Saint Nicholas with Black Pete's, his servants. And in the past few years, there have been very strong reactions to the depiction of Black people as servants in this so-called tradition, and rightly so in my view. In fact, in 2015, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination rapped the Netherlands on the knuckles, saying that the character of Black Pete is problematic and that particularly people of African descent living in the Netherlands experience this tradition as a vestige of slavery and that it is hurtful to the dignity and self-esteem of children and adults of African descent. Although our political leaders have long ignored this, due to the Black Lives Matter movement, things seem to be changing. And recently, in fact, yesterday, Prime Minister Rutte has met the group involved in what is called Kick Out Zwarte Piet. So these are some headlines, international headlines. People have been arrested in Black Pete protests, and this movement has become quite strong and has led to quite a few tensions in Dutch society, where there's now a large group of Dutch people of African descent, of Indonesian descent, who feel increasingly uncomfortable with these colonial stereotypes. Staying in the Netherlands and thinking about the traditional opening of the parliamentary year, usually the king arrives in the golden carriage. And what is interesting is that there are these pictures on the doors and below the windows of the golden carriage. And if we zoom into those pictures, we actually see colonial depictions where people of a brown color are usually in subordinate positions. So this is really, celebrating, these pictures seem to celebrate our colonial history. This, of course, is quite problematic in 2020, in the 21st century. And here you see this white woman on the throne. There's a clear reference to the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. And these people are all bowing their heads to the white masters. So the question becomes whether these type of pictures can still be shown, and whether when we open the parliamentary year in the Dutch democracy, whether it's wise that the king arrives in a carriage with those kind of pictures. Obviously, Black Lives Matter, particularly in the US, but also in Europe and other places, have made a big impression on the type of discussions taking place. and the demand of for change that I think is necessary when we talk about race and when we talk about people of color in many of our societies around the globe. One book that really hit home and that was what made a big impression on me is the book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, American journalist and writer, who, when his son turned 16, decided to write him a letter, and he published this as a book. And basically what he does is he explains what it means to grow up and to live in America, inhabiting a black body and all the fears that go with that. In terms of slavery in the US, I read the book by Colson Whitehead a few years ago, which was also really visceral in its description of the way in which the white masters treated their black slaves. There are several activists, and I think for students it might be interesting to listen to the activist Angela Davis, a famous activist in the 60s and 70s for the civil rights movement in the US, and now a grande dame of activism. And she delivered the Steve Biko memorial lecture in South Africa a few years ago. And I think what she has to say on the Black Lives Matter movement, but also on the role of students and the role of critical thinking, is really useful. So if you have time, visit the lecture and listen to this. This year we included an article by Robtel Nijay Paley in the course, Decentering the White Gaze of Development. And there is, if you go to the article, there is a link, a URL, where you can hear her speak about this particular topic. And I think it's a really important contribution to a critical debate. And basically what Robtel Paley says is that we can't engage properly with development without recognizing that these racial tropes play a major role in the way the West or outsiders deal with these developing countries. Okay, so when we slowly move our focus towards the Congo, I think it's important to recognize that even in this day and age, so these pictures are partly from 2018, the Congo is still what we call a conflict area. Millions are fleeing. There is lots of violence. There are militias active. But what is also important to recognize is that the international community, be it international organizations, but also several governments and transnational companies, are partly co-responsible for some of the terrible issues that the Congo is still facing in this day and age. So this is an example, a 2016 example of a mining company that is funding armed men. And we always talk about corruption as something internal to Africa and specific to Africa, but we often forget to name the external actors involved. I would say that colonialism is still very much part of our world today. We have colonial legacies like the economic legacies, social legacies, cultural, environmental and political legacies. And I think we have important questions to answer in terms of the existing inequalities in the past and the present. Some interesting books have come out. The Congo book is a translation of the book that you see here on the shelf by Van Rijbroek, a Belgian intellectual and journalist. And in terms of the Netherlands, recently a few books came out. Roofstaat, which is very interesting. It was published by the rap label Top Notch in order to speak about our colonial history, especially targeted at young people, because the idea is that the Netherlands has not really dealt with its colonial past. And a book that came out this year is a shortened version. It's the Burning Kampongs. It's a very critical view on the way in which the Dutch tried to oppress the freedom movement in Indonesia. Another book that you see here on the shelf is the book The Golden Rhinoceros. And I think that's an interesting book because it's an attempt to give Africa more history. Because it's weird that when we talk about, for example, the Zimbabwe ruins, we rarely hear about these civilizations that existed in Africa, and Africa is still often dealt with as a territory without history. So that is something to keep in mind also during this lecture. All right, let's go to the Congo, and sadly, this is a story of violence that we deal with this afternoon. The focus will be particularly on external meddling in Africa, on colonialism, and then briefly on the issues that happened during independence, the independence struggle, and the Cold War. So what are some of the elements of colonialism? Obviously, there's foreign domination, but what we tend to forget is that there was always the argument of scientific advancement. And indeed, as Rob Paley also says, the racism and the violence is something to take into account. But it was also, and the lecture will show that it was also a matter of raw materials, commercial agriculture, and the extraction of labor, quite often in very violent manners. Now here are three of the people who play a role in this lecture. We have King Leopold, the Belgian king. We have a notorious explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, and we have a one of the first African leaders, Patrice Lumumba, who is often forgotten when we talk about recent African history. Quite a few of you might not have heard of Patrice Lumumba, and he'll feature in this lecture. The Congo is still very popular in terms also of literature and film. There is the novel of Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, and then the inspired movie in the 1990s, Apocalypse Now, that dealt with or was inspired by the book by Joseph Conrad. Apocalypse Now, of course, is about Vietnam. It's about the role of the US military. It's a gripping movie, but it was inspired by the novel by Joseph Conrad. Part of this lecture is inspired by the book by Adam Hochschild, King Leopold's Ghost. If you have time during your holidays to maybe read it, it reads like a crime novel, and it's a very gripping story. There are other fascinating books, like I said, the book by von Rijbroek. There's a recent book on the murdering Patrice Lumumba, and a book on Kabila and from Leopold to Kabila. But for me, this novel that came out a year ago is interesting. Out of Darkness, Shining Light. Again, there is this reference to darkness. This is an African author, Petina Gappa, and she writes about the Livingstone expedition from the point of view of the Africans involved in the expedition. So it puts a very different spotlight on this whole endeavor, and it's about the way in which the Africans involved in the expedition tried to return the body of Livingstone after his death to England. All right, today we'll talk largely about the creation of the Congo Free State, and there is lots of deception and violence involved. So let's get on with it. Let's first talk about the explorers and the king. What is interesting to realize, often when we talk about colonial history in Africa, we talk about the late 19th century, but the Congo river mouth was discovered by the Portuguese already in 1482. So there is this pillar that was erected referring to the potent prince and king João II of Portugal, and it was erected by Diogo Chao. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. So the Portuguese already discovered the Congo river mouth in earlier times. And very sadly is that by the 1530s, already 5,000 slaves a year were shipped across the Atlantic from this territory. And some of the local royalty was converted to Catholicism. And there is an excerpt here from a local king, a local Congolese king, educated by missionaries, King Afonso I, and he's writing a letter to King João III of Portugal, and this letter is dated 1526. And in this letter he says, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. It's our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the trade or transport of slaves." So what you see here is that almost immediately when these external parties became involved in Congo, slavery and murder and violence became a huge dimension of this endeavor. Now, if we skip 300 years ahead and we realize that in 1838 the British abolished slavery, it was very interesting also when we, let's say, when we think about our own relationship to the Middle East at the moment, that these anti-slavery activities and protests in the 1860s in Europe was largely targeted towards the Arab world. You know, it wasn't Spain, it wasn't Portugal that still allowed slavery in their colonies, like Brazil, that were targeted, but rather a non-white, distant enemy was chosen, the Arab slave trader. One of the early explorers, famous name, David Livingstone, also justified one of his expeditions in 1866 as a way to track and fight slave traders, particularly these Arab slave traders, to convince that was a second goal of the expedition, to try and convert as many Africans to Christianity, and then to discover the Nile and anything else that might need discovering. Obviously, that was then the scientific element of the expedition. And even the Royal Geographical Society in Britain described him then as a missionary, an explorer, and a passionate enemy of the Arab slave trade. So here are some pictures of David Livingstone, and what is interesting to realize and important is that modern media, at least the modern media of that particular period, namely the broadsheet newspapers, in this case the Illustrated London News, provided a regular update on the exploits of Livingstone. So this is a 1873 front page of the newspaper. Now Livingstone at one stage goes missing, and the updates cease, and it becomes necessary to try and find out what happened to this great explorer, at least great explorer in the eyes of the British. So someone else is hired, and this is Henry Morton Stanley. And in fact, this new expedition becomes a great human interest scoop, and it also becomes a important PR stunt for a US newspaper, the New York Herald. So the publisher, James Gordon Bennett, employs Henry Morton Stanley to try and find Livingstone, and thus also finances this expedition. Henry Morton Stanley is a very colorful figure, a very notorious explorer of the African continent. At one stage, he kind of reinvents himself several times in his life. He starts off as John Rowlands, grows up in a poor house, in a workhouse, to keep the poor off the streets in the UK. He also fights in the American Civil War, both for the North and for the South. He's involved in fighting in Turkey. But at one point he adopts a new name, Henry Morton Stanley, double name, to become a little bit more noble in the view of others, and he becomes an African explorer. So he does succeed in finding Livingstone, and that is where the famous phrase "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," comes from. When Livingstone comes out of his tent and Henry Morton Stanley meets him. What Stanley does is also write books about this endeavor, and when he returns to Europe he goes on a big lecture tour and is hailed in several European countries and paid hefty fees for his story. Someone who is really impressed by the story of Stanley is King Leopold II of Belgium. Someone who has lots of ambition, who has already thought about starting several colonies. At one point he's interested in Argentina. He's invested in the Suez Canal Company, and he's particularly interested for gaining money and power and recognition by other royals in Europe. So King Leopold is using particularly the public opinion to set himself up as a philanthropist. And again, what you see here is the element of curbing the Arab slave trade. He also talks about the moral upliftment of uncivilized savages, and mentions and becomes active in the advancement of science, particularly geographical exploration. What is rarely mentioned, or basically never mentioned, is his profit motive, the fact that he seeks recognition of other royal houses in Europe, and that he's basically power hungry. If you go to Belgium, particularly Tervuren, where there is the former colonial museum that has been recently renovated, you see this palace, you see the big bust of King Leopold, and basically the money that was made by his exploits in the Congo was invested in this fantastic infrastructure in Belgium, like the Dutch have invested their profits in building Amsterdam, building our palaces and musea, etc., etc. In the museum, when you enter the central hall, there is a figure in gold with people looking up to him who look particularly African. And there is this little plaque below the statue, which I've photographed here. And it says, "Belgium brings civilization to the Congo." I guess that after this lecture, there is a big question mark whether we can indeed make that assertion. King Leopold starts by organizing a geographical conference in 1876 in Brussels, and he holds a speech there, and he says that he's interested to open to civilization the only part of our globe which it has not yet penetrated, to pierce the darkness which hangs over entire peoples, as I dare say a crusade worthy of this century of progress. He sets up an organization called the International African Association, and he adopts a flag where the dark blue symbolizes the darkness in Africa, and the star, the light that he intends to bring to the continent. He then proceeds to hire Stanley and to undertake a expedition in order to map the territory around the Congo River. Stanley is paid a hefty amount of money, in today's currency, roughly $250,000. And he also establishes a committee of a Comité d'études du Haut-Congo. So the idea of hiring Stanley is that there is a base being set up at the Congo River mouth, the same mouth that was discovered several hundred years ago by the Portuguese. Then construct a road around the rapids to the plateau up the mountains. And then to bring several steamboats that have been disassembled in Belgium, and bring these parts up the mountains and assemble them so that the Congo River can be explored, and set up along the Congo River a chain of trading stations. Now, one of the problems was that there were no draft animals like oxen or horses in this part of Africa, because they all died of tropical diseases if they imported them. So there was only one way to bring all these materials up the mountains. And I think here is one of the first examples of what we could simply call the abuse of black bodies. If we look at an excerpt from the Heart of Darkness novel by Joseph Conrad, Joseph Conrad, who himself at one stage is a steamboat captain in the Congo, he writes the following: "A slight clinking behind me made me turn my head. 6 black men advanced in file, toiling up the path. They walked erect and slow, balancing small baskets full of earth on their heads, and the clink kept time with their footsteps. Black rags were wound around their loins, and the short ends behind waggled to and fro like tails. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope. Each had an iron collar on his neck, and all were connected together with a chain." So here he describes the exploitation and the violence involved in making these black bodies work for the colonial powers. And here are some pictures from the Congo of these porters bringing stuff up the mountain or through the jungle in large convoys. African porters carried white administrators to their destinations, and I think it shows the inequalities that were involved in this endeavor. Stanley himself was not a particular friendly and subtle person. In the museum in Tervuren there is his gun that is displayed, and he was moving through the hinterland with his private army, and it was said in that time, Bunduki Sultani ya Barabara, meaning the gun is the Sultan of the hinterland, and Stanley's nickname became Bulamatari, the breaker of rocks. So he used brutal force whenever he thought it was necessary to subdue the peoples of the interior. He sets up these trading posts and he signs treaties with kings and chiefs. And what we see here is a picture I made in the museum of one of these treaties where a local king has signed a cross. And this was done so-called legally, because what King Leopold does is hiring an Oxford scholar to draft the texts. And as Leopold has asked this scholar, these treaties must be as brief as possible and in a couple of articles must grant us everything. They purchase land, and it's very simple and very sad. It's by giving out cloth and beads and lots of alcohol. And once they recognize that there are very few people living there, simply large tracts of land in the Congo are declared so-called vacant lands and then taken into possession. There are other elements that Leopold uses to get hold of the Congolese territory. You could say deception is one. The United States, Chancellor Bismarck, the Berlin Conference, and then granting business concessions. In order to confuse the public, Leopold starts another organization, namely the International Association of the Congo. It basically replaces the earlier association, and they adopt the same flag for this new association. He also sends a convoy to an American diplomat. He pays an American diplomat to lobby President Arthur. And basically he tells the Americans, what I want to do, what Leopold want to do is start a territory in the Congo Basin, and in this territory there will be free international trade. So this is actually a successful endeavor, and the US then announces its sympathy with and approval of the humane and benevolent purposes of this International Association of the Congo, administering as it does the interests of the free states. They're established and will recognize the flag of the International African Association as the flag of a friendly government. So basically, Leopold says, if you let me administer the territory, all other nations of the West can visit there and can trade there freely, and I will protect them. Leopold also contacts Chancellor Bismarck, who's one of the most powerful European figures at the time, and Bismarck is really afraid that France or England or Portugal take hold of the territory in the Congo, and he realizes that he rather has a relatively weak royal house, namely the Royal House of Belgium, administer this territory than France, England, or Portugal. Then there is the famous or notorious Berlin Conference. Leopold himself doesn't attend, but he sends his lobbyist and hero, Henry Morton Stanley, who is revered by many of the European leaders. And the proposal is again that this philanthropist Leopold and his association become the administering force of the Congo Basin to ensure international free trade. So the delegates seem to be convinced, and as they believe that this is going to be what is called an international colony, they agree that Leopold can do his thing. However, Leopold is clever because only shortly thereafter, by royal decree, he establishes what he calls the Congo Free State, and it becomes what is called in French a domaine de la couronne, a crown domain. And so basically King Leopold II himself as a person becomes the owner of this vast territory in Africa. And the last element is that Leopold uses is co-option of the business community. Although this example is of a few years later, I think it is illustrative of the businesses that were involved in colonial endeavors. So he gives William Lever a large concession of natural oil palm groves in the Congo. And William Lever, of course, becomes one of the founding fathers of Unilever, and in the early period he starts Sunlight soap. So here we see that one of the still dominant transnational corporations active in the world has its roots in the exploits in the Congo in the early 20th century. And there you have it. There King Leopold II is the owner and sole proprietor, and you could say dictator of the Congo Free State. So let's now focus on the extraction of goods and natural resources of the Congo, and particularly on what we could call the pillaging and the plundering and the violence and the atrocities involved. As I said earlier, King Leopold was particularly interested in the wealth, to extract every possible penny of wealth. And in first instance, he focused on ivory, but that didn't yield enough profit. So the second element became the most profitable at one stage, and that was rubber. And by focusing on rubber, we also see how the extraction of wealth and natural resources from the colonies was strongly linked to the Industrial Revolution taking place in Europe. King Leopold, after a few years, comes to the conclusion that he has large financial difficulties. It's much more expensive to administer the Congo than he thought. But there is an invention on the European continent, namely Mr. Dunlop, here with beard, on a bicycle, has made a huge invention, namely the inflatable tire. And in order to produce inflatable tires, there is a huge demand for rubber. And that is exactly what King Leopold and his administrators are going to do, provide the world with rubber, cheap rubber. How do they do this? They first set up an army, the so-called force publique. These are generally recruited from other African countries, Ethiopia, Somalia, but also local soldiers or local men in the Congo. Very brutal force. They go into the Congo with small army units. Usually what they do is they round up the women and the children, put them in a cattle pen, and only release the women and the children once the men go into the forest and collect rubber. Here you see how this rubber gathering takes place. These are the rubber vines. They make cuts in the bark, and the liquid drips into the bowl, and this becomes the caoutchouc, the rubber that is necessary. Here you see the force publique moving through the forest, and here prisoners that have been taken, because once you did not collect enough rubber or refused rubber, you were taken into custody. If you didn't produce enough rubber, there was the hippo hide whip, the chicotte, that was used in a terrible fashion to maim people and to force them to produce rubber as necessary. Now, these force publique units, army units, were basically under-financed and under-resourced, and they would use their ammunition that was very scarce and expensive, to go into the forest and hunt for bushmeat. However, they had to account for every bullet that they used, and therefore they were extremely cruel to the local population. Because they could only use bullets in combat, and once they killed an enemy, they would cut off a hand to show that, I've used this bullet in a proper fashion. But as they used the bullets rather to hunt for animals, they went into the local villages and cut hands off people, sometimes children, and use those hands to then say to their superiors, we've used our bullets wisely. And these severed hands, here you see a few local people with the hands. These hands were then dried above a fire, cured, and brought to the Belgian heads of the militias, in order to say, okay, we've used our bullets in a proper fashion. A terrible, cruel way of dealing with the local population. And it became, these severed hands became a symbol of Leopold's cruelty in Africa. And it wasn't long before an international outcry was heard. And one of the most vocal adversaries in Europe was a shipping clerk from Liverpool, Edmund Dean Morel. And he became an activist, and he became instrumental in bringing the story of the Congo, of the brutal violence into the world, and trying to stop Leopold doing what he did in the Congo Basin. The activist Morel establishes in that period a weekly paper, the West African Mail, to report about the Congo atrocities. He starts what we would nowadays call an NGO, the Congo Reform Society. He also starts what you could call an international human rights network, and he becomes a very prolific writer in producing books about the Congo. For example, Red Rubber and The Black Man's Burden. This is a copy of Red Rubber, and you see someone who resembles King Leopold. Here you see the cut off hands on the scale of inhumanity, and there's rubber mentioned. So he became a vocal opponent of King Leopold in Europe. Now this international human rights network became a rather big network in Europe, with also a center in the UK. And here you see a protest, a demonstration of a gathering in the Royal Albert Hall in 1909, where the Archbishop of Canterbury was there, and several important speakers. So in Europe, this became a very big movement to try and stop these Belgian atrocities. Also, some of the leading authors of the time became involved. Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a book, Le Crime du Congo, The Crimes of Congo. Mark Twain wrote a play, King Leopold's Soliloquy, and obviously someone like Joseph Conrad also became involved in publicizing the atrocities taking place. Now, some of the stories that came to Morel, the shipping clerk, he set up contacts with several missionaries also active in the Congo Basin, and one famous missionary was William Shepherd. He was an American missionary. There is a very interesting book written about him called Black Livingston, basically telling his life story. And you know, it's a fascinating book, so I can recommend it to all of you to read it in your spare time. This is a black American who wants to do well, who wants to do good in Africa, and he goes and lives in the Congo. But you know, if you read the book, it's very hard to believe. But his first expedition, his first exploits, are actually financed in the US by white supremacist groups, because the white supremacists think that if they subsidize William Shepherd in his endeavor to set up a new home in the Congo, then maybe he can convince other blacks to leave the US and start a new life in Africa. Now, William Shepherd becomes very vocal about the atrocities that he encounters, and he's also someone who is being taken seriously and who's taken in by local Congolese royalty, who see in him a brother helping them to fight the atrocities by the Belgians. Someone else who reports about the atrocities is Roger Casement. He's a friend of Joseph Conrad, and he writes a report in 1903 in England on the atrocities and the terrible situation in the Congo. Now, King Leopold is getting under pressure in Europe, so he decides to set up what he calls an international commission of inquiry. But he's quite comfortable because he sets up this commission, and he strongly influences who is on the commission, and he expects the commission to clear his name. The commission is supposed to leave for Congo, hold hearings, hear witnesses, and produce a report. Now, things don't go so well for Leopold because the commission goes. Here you see them at a local village where they speak to the dignitaries and hold these hearings. And after several months in the Congo and taking 370 depositions, the conclusions confirm, in fact, the reports by Morel, by Casement, and the critical missionaries, and the report is very damning for Leopold II. Now, this is a day and age, 1906, with well-established newspapers. So there are interviews with Leopold II, and in one of these interviews, he reacts to the findings of the commission and the situation in the Congo. And in this quote, I think you hear his voice. It must be noticed, however, also that King Leopold himself never really visited the Congo, but obviously he was responsible for the atrocities and for the violence perpetrated in his name. In the interview, he says, "It's curious what satisfaction certain people get spending their lives libeling others. I suppose there is nobody in Europe painted as a monster of such blackness as I am. The words used in picturing my perfidy cannot be repeated in polite society. I'm an ogre who delights to torture helpless African Negroes. It would be absurd for us to mistreat the blacks, because no state prospers unless the population is happy and increasing." But despite these PR efforts on his part, his time in the Congo was over after the commission produced its report. And this is, again, these are the pictures of the palaces. For example, this is now the Colonial Museum in Tervuren, and the infrastructure that was financed in Belgium through the exploits of King Leopold II. Between 1 and 10 million people were killed. I think already this range is a slap in the face of Africans, that we don't really know how many people were killed during the colonial reign of King Leopold in the Congo. This is what Africa looked like in 1910, and this is here central, one of the biggest territories in Africa, Belgian Congo. because King Leopold withdraws, steps down as administrator or as owner of the Congo, and hands over the Congo to the Belgian government. All right, let's maybe take a little break, have a cup of tea, and then we come back. You can pause the video and then you can come back and we talk about the independence and the Cold War in the Congo, where basically the murder, the violence and the pillage continues. Maybe when we talk about independence and when we talk about, let's say, the situation in Africa in the late 20th century and still in the early 21st century, it might be wise to look at the work of Thomas Pogge, who writes about poverty and what he calls explanatory nationalism. Thomas Pogge explains to us that when we write about the problems of, for example, Africa, there's often this reference to corruption and to the problematic governance of local regimes. And he says, what we fail to see often, and what we often on purpose forget, is to look at the foreign and global influences regarding these flawed governments and institutions in Africa. You cannot explain the problems of the Congo by only looking at the Congolese actors. You have to broaden your view and you have to look at the global actors that are involved in the Congo or in supporting the local powerful elites in the Congo. According to Pogge, there are powerful external actors, for example, these transnational corporations that pursue maximum extraction at minimum cost. You have to take into account what he calls the international resource privilege, that once someone is at the helm of government in these states, that they can capture as much as possible, and they become, they are in charge of extracting the resources, and also the regime has the ability to borrow money internationally and create debts, which then is a huge burden on the local population. But his main message is, Pogge's main message is, don't forget to look at the external actors when we try and explain the problems of Africa. And therefore, very briefly, I want to speak about the independence period in Congo and who was involved in the oppression in that particular period. So indeed, in the 1960s, many African countries became independent. For example, Zambia in 1964, Zimbabwe in 1980, with the famous Bob Marley concert. And you could say that only in 1994, when South Africa adopted its new constitution after Mandela was released, only in 1994 the whole continent was so-called independent. But we also have to realize that the Cold War in the 1960s and 70s was fought in Africa. And one of the countries in which this fight took place was the Congo/Zaire. And what we see, and that is what I briefly want to discuss, what we see is that the first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated, and his successor, Mobutu Sese Seko, became one of the most brutal pro-Western dictators in 1971, who changed the name of the country to Zaire. Here we see pictures around the time of the independence of Congo. We see Patrice Lumumba and the first president, Kasavubu, and we see the Belgian king, King Baudouin, young man at the time. Patrice Lumumba, an African intellectual, well-educated, very proud and also very critical about Belgian interference in the Congo, and wanting to express the frustrations and the hurt of his people to the rest of the world. So what Lumumba does is, during the independence celebrations, the official handover. So here we see King Baudouin and some of the white military, Belgian military and white dignitaries sitting on the podium, and Patrice Lumumba delivering the speech, the independence speech. Lumumba, in the eyes of King Baudouin, offends the West. Now, I'm not going to read this whole quote, but basically what Lumumba does, and you can actually listen to parts of the speech on YouTube. It's a very powerful speech, where he basically says, Belgium has done terrible things in the territory, and that it was not some kind of friendly gesture by Belgium to give us our country back, but it was by fighting that it has been won, a day-to-day fight, an ardent and idealistic fight, a fight in which we were spared neither privation nor suffering, and for which we gave our strength and our blood. And he ends the speech saying, "We have known ironies, insults, blows that we endured morning, noon, and evening because we are Negroes." And this speech has, by the new African leader, that recognizes the suffering that took place, the violence that took place, the enormous amount of deaths that were caused by the Belgian interference. This speech really offends the old colonial power. And it has tremendous consequences, and very, very sad consequences, which is described in two books. First, very important book that came out, The Assassination of Lumumba, and recently this book came out, Death in the Congo, Murdering Patrice Lumumba. Because 7 months, just realize this, 7 months after independence and after the independence speech, Prime Minister Lumumba is assassinated, arrested and assassinated in the Congo. And it has now become clear that Belgian and American forces were involved in the assassination. I won't play the clip, but there are these links here that you should absolutely look at yourself. This is a clip of a cinema news item. And what you see here is that Lumumba is captured and is being manhandled by the soldiers of Mobutu. Now, after many years, and particularly after certain CIA files became public files, it now has become clear who was involved in the murder of Lumumba. So first there was a CIA operation called Operation Barracuda. It was an aborted attempt to poison Lumumba, and it was a failed attempt. But in the end, the Belgians became involved. They supported the elimination of the Lumumba government. They recognized the independence of Katanga province under another leader, namely Chombe. Here you see the divide and rule policy of the former colonial power. But in fact, King Baudouin himself became involved in ordering a solution, and he requests, and there are records of this, he requests elimination définitive of Lumumba. And Lumumba is captured, arrested, and brought to a prison in Katanga. And Katanga is the province where the opponents of Lumumba were in power. And from that moment onwards, Lumumba disappears. And there are now sources that have confirmed that he was shot in the jungle and that his body was chopped up and burnt so that no one could visit this place of a grave of one of the first great African leaders. But also the United Nations in that period under Dag Hammarskjöld is criticized because they didn't come to the aid of Lumumba, and they turned a blind eye when he was taken prisoner. They had a presence in Congo at the time. In 2001, there is an inquiry by the Belgian Parliament, and this was the first time when they said, Belgian ministers at the time were morally responsible for what happened. And there was a declaration saying that King Baudouin violated the constitution by acting alone. Now, if we fast forward to 2020, we see, and also returning to the beginning of this lecture, we see that the Black Lives Matter movement has become quite active in Belgium as well. Here we see a picture of one of the busts of King Leopold that is being removed. And this pressure and this renewed attention for the atrocities that took place in the Belgian Congo have spurred the parliament in Belgium to set up a Congo committee that is going to start work roughly now, so the summer of 2020, to look into its colonial past, the Belgian colonial past, and to try and promote reconciliation with those living in Belgium and with the people living in the Congo. There are plenty of other examples of Cold War conflicts in Africa. Let's not forget Angola, a 27-year-long war where the UNITA resistance movement was supported by the West, trying to get rid of the Angolan Marxist regime. This only ended in 2002. In Mozambique, one of the most horrible wars taking place on the African continent, 19 years until 1994. This Renamo resistance movement, also supported by the West, fighting a Marxist regime. And then you could say South Africa, where the ANC fought the apartheid regime until 1994. So lots of conflict, Cold War conflicts in Africa taking place, where the big powers were clashing. All right, this is it for now. So what we have looked at is some of the examples of, particularly in the Congo, of the atrocities taking place in Africa, and the enormous focus on the extraction of resources in Africa. And some would say that this type of extraction is still taking place but in a very different form in the 21st century. Anyway, I hope it was interesting and that we will meet soon in a more healthy environment. So stay healthy, stay fit, and goodbye from me.